The autumn wind cut through downtown Cincinnati like a razor, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and the distant aroma of chili from Skyline. Pete Rose pulled his worn leather jacket tighter around his shoulders as he walked down Vine Street, his weathered face hidden beneath the shadow of a Cincinnati Reds cap, one of the few reminders of better days that he still allowed himself to wear. It had been 3 years since the gambling scandal broke wide open. 3 years since he'd been banned from baseball for life. 3 years of watching his legacy crumble like old concrete, of seeing former teammates cross the street to avoid him, of enduring the whispers and pointed fingers that followed him wherever he went in the city that once worshipped him as Charlie Hustle. The October evening was growing dark, and the streets were beginning to empty as office workers hurried home to their families, their warm dinners, their lives that still made sense. Pete had nowhere particular to go. His apartment, a modest one-bedroom in a building that had seen better decades, waited for him with its silence and its ghosts. Another night of bad television, another night of wondering how it had all gone so wrong. As he turned the corner onto Race Street, he nearly stumbled over a small figure huddled against the brick wall of an abandoned storefront. The building had once housed Kowalski's Sporting Goods, where Pete used to buy his first baseball gloves as a kid. Now its windows were boarded up, covered in graffiti and layers of torn posters advertising concerts from years past. "Sorry, kid," Pete muttered, regaining his balance and preparing to continue on his way. But something made him pause. The figure against the wall was smaller than he'd initially thought. A boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, wearing clothes that were too big for his slight frame. A dirty Reds t-shirt hung loose on his shoulders, and his jeans were torn at both knees. His sneakers, once white, were now grey with wear and stained with God knew what. The boy looked up at Pete, with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. They were brown, almost black in the dim streetlight, and they held a wariness that spoke of too many disappointments, too many adults who had promised help and delivered nothing. "You okay, son?" Pete heard himself asking, though he wasn't sure why. He had his own problems, his own demons to wrestle with. The last thing he needed was to get involved with some runaway kid. The boy shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey volumes about his situation without saying a word. He had a small cardboard sign propped against his knees that read "Hungry" in crayon letters that were smeared from rain. Pete glanced around the street. Rush hour traffic moved past without slowing, drivers focused on getting home, getting away from the deteriorating downtown area where people like this kid ended up when they had nowhere else to go. A few pedestrians hurried by, their eyes carefully averted, as if not seeing the boy would somehow make him not exist. "What's your name?" Pete asked, surprised again by his own question. The boy studied him for a long moment before answering. "Marcus," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the traffic noise. "I'm Pete," he replied, then immediately regretted it. The last thing he needed was word getting out that Pete Rose was hanging around with street kids. The media would have a field day with that story. But Marcus didn't show any sign of recognition. Of course not. The kid was probably born around the time Pete's career was ending. To him, Pete was just another middle-aged man in a baseball cap, probably no different from the dozens of others who walked past him every day without a second glance. "You hungry, Marcus?" The boy nodded, a simple gesture that somehow broke Pete's heart in a way he hadn't expected. When was the last time he'd felt anything beyond his own bitterness and self-pity? "Come on," Pete said, nodding toward the neon glow of a diner half a block down the street. "Let's get you something to eat." Marcus looked at him suspiciously, and Pete couldn't blame him. The kid had probably learned the hard way that nothing in life came free, especially not from strangers. "No strings attached," Pete added, "just food." After a moment's hesitation, Marcus gathered his few possessions, a small backpack that looked like it had been through a war, and a thin blanket that might have once been blue. and stood up. He was even smaller than Pete had thought, probably underweight and definitely underfed. They walked in silence to Mel's Diner, a place that had been serving the same greasy comfort food for 40 years. The bell above the door jangled as they entered, and Pete caught the look that passed between the waitress and the cook when they saw Marcus. It was a look he'd been seeing more and more directed at himself lately, a mixture of suspicion and barely concealed disgust. 2 menus, Pete said firmly, sliding into a booth near the back. The vinyl seats were cracked and patched with duct tape, but they were clean and the place was warm. Marcus sat across from him, his thin frame nearly swallowed by the booth. He handled the menu like it was made of gold, studying each item with the intensity of someone for whom a meal was a precious commodity, not a given. "Order whatever you want," Pete said, though he made a quick mental calculation of the cash in his wallet. His pension from Major League Baseball had been suspended along with everything else, and his savings were running lower than he liked to admit. Marcus ordered carefully, a cheeseburger, fries, and a chocolate milkshake. Simple food, kid food, but he said please and thank you with each item, displaying manners that suggested he hadn't always lived on the streets. While they waited for the food, Pete found himself studying the boy more closely. Despite the dirt and the 2 big clothes, there was something dignified about Marcus, something that suggested he'd once known a different kind of life. His grammar was good when he spoke, which wasn't often, and he held himself with a quiet pride that reminded Pete of something he couldn't quite place. "You live around here?" Pete asked. Marcus shrugged again, that universal gesture that Pete was beginning to recognize as his default response to questions that might reveal too much. "Got family?" This time the shrug came with a slight tightening around the eyes, and Pete decided not to push. He knew something about wanting to keep painful subjects buried. The food arrived, and Pete watched as Marcus ate with the focused intensity of someone who wasn't sure when his next meal might come. He didn't wolf it down. If anything, he ate more slowly than Pete would have expected, as if he were trying to make it last as long as possible. "Good?" Pete asked. Marcus nodded, and for the first time since Pete had met him, the kid smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and brief, but it transformed his face completely. For just a moment, he looked like what he was, a child. "Mr. Pete," Marcus said quietly, "why'd you help me?" The question caught Pete off guard. Why had he helped? He'd been asking himself the same thing since they'd sat down. Maybe it was because he knew what it felt like to be invisible, to have people look through you like you didn't matter. Maybe it was because he'd seen that same wariness in his own eyes lately when he looked in the mirror. "I don't know," Pete answered honestly. "Maybe because we all need help sometimes." Marcus considered this, taking another careful bite of his burger. "Most people, they don't see me," he said. "It's like I'm not there." Pete felt something twist in his chest. "I see you," he said. And he did. For the first time in months, Pete Rose was seeing something other than his own problems, his own pain. He was seeing this kid who somehow managed to maintain his dignity, even when the world had written him off as invisible. They finished eating in comfortable silence. When the check came, Pete left a larger tip than he could afford, partly because he remembered what it was like to struggle, and partly because he wanted to make some small statement against the looks they'd received when they walked in. Outside the diner, Marcus shifted his backpack and looked up at Pete uncertainly. "Where do you usually sleep?" Pete asked. Marcus nodded toward the general direction of the riverfront. "There's places," he said vaguely. Pete looked at his watch. It was nearly 8 o'clock and the temperature was dropping. Cincinnati in October could be brutal, especially for someone without proper shelter. "Look," Pete said, surprising himself again. "I've got a couch. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. You can crash there tonight if you want. No questions asked." Marcus studied his face for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Trust was obviously something he didn't give easily. Tomorrow you can go back to wherever you want," Pete added. But tonight you don't have to be cold." Finally, Marcus nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "Thank you." As they walked through the Cincinnati streets toward Pete's apartment building, Pete couldn't help but wonder what the hell he was doing. A month ago, if someone had told him he'd be taking a homeless kid home, he'd have laughed. But something about Marcus, something about the way he carried himself despite everything, had gotten under Pete's skin. Maybe it was because they were both outcasts now, both invisible in their own ways. Or maybe it was because helping someone else was the first thing in 3 years that had made Pete feel like the man he used to be. Before the gambling and the scandal and the spectacular fall from grace. Whatever it was, as they climbed the stairs to his second-floor apartment, Pete felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. It was small and fragile, this feeling, but it was real. And for the first time since his world had collapsed, Pete Rose was looking forward to tomorrow. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of Pete's apartment, casting long shadows across the living room where Marcus lay sleeping on the couch. Pete stood in his small kitchenette, nursing his second cup of coffee and watching the kid sleep. In the soft morning light, Marcus looked even younger and more fragile than he had the night before. Pete had been awake since 5. Old habits from his playing days died hard, even in disgrace. He'd spent the early hours sitting in his recliner, wondering what the hell he'd gotten himself into. Taking in a homeless kid wasn't exactly in his life plan, such as it was, but watching Marcus sleep, seeing the way the tension had finally left the boy's face, Pete found he didn't regret his decision. Marcus stirred around 7, his eyes opening slowly, confusion crossing his features for a moment before he remembered where he was. He sat up carefully, as if testing whether this was all real. "Morning," Pete said, keeping his voice low. "You want some breakfast?" Marcus nodded, running a hand through his dark hair. "Thank you for letting me stay," he said, his manners once again suggesting a background very different from his current circumstances. Pete made pancakes, about the only thing he could cook that didn't come from a can, and they ate in comfortable silence. Marcus ate more slowly this morning, not with the desperate hunger of the night before, but with genuine appreciation. "So," Pete said as they finished eating, "what's your story, Marcus? And don't tell me you don't have one. Everybody's got a story." Marcus looked down at his empty plate, considering. "My mom died 2 years ago," he said finally. "Cancer. My dad, he tried for a while, but," he shrugged, that familiar gesture. "He started drinking more, lost his job at the Ford plant, lost our house." Pete felt his chest tighten. He'd grown up in Cincinnati, knew plenty of families that had been torn apart when the manufacturing jobs disappeared. "What happened to your dad?" "He's around somewhere," Marcus said, but his tone suggested that was about all he knew. "He dropped me at my aunt's house last spring, said he'd be back when he got on his feet. Aunt Linda, she tried, but she's got 4 kids of her own and not much money. I heard her and her husband fighting about me, about the food I was eating, the space I was taking up." "So you left," Marcus nodded. "Figured it was better for everybody. I can take care of myself." The statement was heartbreaking in its matter-of-fact delivery. This kid, who couldn't weigh more than 80 pounds soaking wet, honestly believed he was better off on the streets than burdening his family. "How long you been out there?" "Since school started, about 6 weeks." "School," Pete repeated. "You should be in school." Marcus shrugged again. "Can't go to school when you don't have an address. Can't get clean clothes or take showers regular. Kids notice stuff like that." Pete knew he was right. He also knew that every day Marcus spent on the streets made it harder for him to ever make it back to anything resembling a normal life. "Tell you what," Pete said, surprised by his own words. "Why don't you stick around for a few days? I could use the company and you could use some regular meals. Maybe we can figure out what comes next." Marcus looked at him suspiciously. Why would you do that? It was a fair question, and Pete wasn't sure he had a good answer. Because, he said finally, sometimes people need help, and sometimes the people who need help are the ones who can help each other. Over the next few days, they fell into an unlikely routine. Marcus would sleep late, probably the first real rest he'd gotten in weeks, while Pete read the newspaper and wondered what former teammates were doing with their comfortable retirements. In the afternoons, they'd walk around the city, Pete showing Marcus places from his childhood, Marcus showing Pete the hidden corners and forgotten spaces where people like him survived. It was Marcus who showed Pete the community garden behind the old Kroller furniture factory, where a group of elderly residents grew vegetables and flowers in defiance of the urban decay around them. It was Marcus who knew which downtown business owners would give day-old food to hungry kids and which ones would call the police. It was Marcus who understood the complex social structure of the city's forgotten people in ways that Pete, despite growing up here, had never bothered to learn. You see a lot, Pete told him one afternoon as they sat by the Ohio River, watching the occasional barge push its way upstream. When you're invisible, people don't hide things from you, Marcus replied. They act like you're not there, so you hear stuff, see stuff they don't mean for anyone to notice. Like what? Marcus was quiet for a moment, picking up stones and tossing them into the brown water. Like Mrs. Patterson from the diner. She gives leftovers to street kids, but her husband doesn't know. She hides it because he says it just encourages them to stick around. Pete thought about the woman who'd served them that first night, remembered the disapproving look she'd given Marcus. Or like Mr. Henderson, who owns the sporting goods store on Central, Marcus continued. He looks mean, yells at kids who hang around his shop, but twice a week he leaves a bag of sandwiches by the dumpster behind his store, makes it look like garbage so nobody knows it's on purpose. Pete was beginning to understand that Marcus saw the city in layers, the surface layer that most people inhabited, and the deeper layer where kindness and cruelty existed side by side, often in the same people. "What do you see when you look at me?" Pete asked. Marcus glanced at him, then back at the river. "I see somebody who's sad," he said simply. "Somebody who used to be important but doesn't feel important anymore. Somebody who's trying to figure out who he is now." The assessment was so accurate, it took Pete's breath away. This kid, who'd been living on the streets for 6 weeks, had seen right through him in a way that therapists and friends and family members had failed to do. That evening, as they shared another meal from Pete's limited cooking repertoire, spaghetti with sauce from a jar, Pete made a decision. "Marcus," he said, "how would you feel about going back to school?" The boy looked up from his plate, wariness immediately creeping back into his eyes. "I told you, I can't. What if you could? What if we figured out a way?" Marcus put down his fork. "You mean it? You're not just saying that?" "I'm saying that everybody deserves a chance to learn, to grow up right. And I'm saying that maybe I know some people who could help us make that happen." It wasn't entirely true. Pete's connections in Cincinnati had become significantly limited since his fall from grace. But looking at Marcus, seeing the hope that was carefully trying not to show itself in the boy's eyes, Pete knew he had to try. "But what about you?" Marcus asked. "I mean, why are you doing all this? What do you get out of it?" Pete considered the question. What was he getting out of it? For the first time in 3 years, he was thinking about someone else's problems instead of his own. For the first time since the scandal broke, he was focused on the future instead of dwelling on the past. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt like he might have something useful to contribute to the world. "I get to remember who I used to be," he said finally. "Before all the mess, before I lost sight of what mattered. Helping you helps me remember that I used to be somebody who tried to do the right thing." Marcus nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense to him. "Okay," he said. "If you think we can make it work, I'd like to try." That night, After Marcus had settled in on the couch with a pillow and blanket that Pete had bought that afternoon, the first new things the apartment had seen in months, Pete sat at his small dining table and made a list. It was a short list. People who might still take his calls, organizations that might help a kid like Marcus, possibilities that might exist if he was willing to swallow his pride and ask for help. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in 3 years, Pete Rose went to sleep, feeling like tomorrow might be better than today. The Hamilton County Department of Children's Services occupied a gray concrete building that looked like it had been designed to crush hope before people even walked through the doors. Pete sat in the waiting area, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, while Marcus fidgeted beside him. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly, pale glow. "Mr. Rose?" A tired-looking woman in her 40s appeared at the desk, holding a manila folder. "I'm Sarah Martinez, Marcus's caseworker." Pete had spent 3 days making phone calls, pulling in favors from the few people who would still take his calls, trying to navigate the bureaucratic maze that stood between Marcus and a normal life. Sarah Martinez was the result of those efforts, a social worker who, according to Pete's contact, actually gave a damn about the kids in her caseload. They followed her down a hallway lined with motivational posters that looked like they'd been hanging there since the Carter administration. Her office was small and cluttered, every surface covered with case files, coffee cups, and the debris of an overworked system. "So," she said, settling behind her desk and opening Marcus's file, "tell me how you two met." Pete had rehearsed this story, sticking to the basics while leaving out the more complicated parts of his own situation. He told her about finding Marcus on the street, about giving him a meal and a place to stay, about wanting to help him get back into school. Sarah listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When Pete finished, she turned to Marcus. "Is that accurate, Marcus? Is there anything you'd like to add?" Marcus shook his head. "Mr. Pete's been good to me," he said quietly. "He's trying to help." Sarah studied them both for a moment. "I'll be honest with you," she said finally. "This isn't a typical situation. Usually when we have a child who's been on the streets, we're looking at foster placement while we try to locate family members. But you're telling me you want to take responsibility for Marcus, Mr. Rose?" "I am," Pete said, though he wasn't entirely sure what that meant. "And you understand that would involve a formal process, background checks, home visits, paperwork?" Pete nodded, though his stomach was already churning at the thought of having his life examined by social workers. His background check would be interesting reading. "There's another issue," Sarah continued, consulting her notes. "We've actually been looking for Marcus since his aunt reported him missing 6 weeks ago." She was quite worried. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "She wasn't worried," he muttered. "She was relieved." "That may be your perception, Marcus, but she filed a missing person report. She's been calling our office regularly asking for updates." Pete saw something flicker across Marcus's face. Surprise, maybe, or hope. It was clear the boy hadn't expected anyone to be looking for him. "I'd like to contact Linda Morrison, your aunt, and let her know you're safe," Sarah said. "Would that be all right with you?" Marcus looked at Pete, who nodded encouragingly. "Okay," the boy said. Sarah made another note in the file. "Now, Mr. Rose, I have to ask, why are you interested in helping Marcus? Do you have experience with children? Family of your own?" Here it was, the question Pete had been dreading. "I don't have kids of my own," he said carefully, "but I know what it's like to feel like the world's given up on you. And I know that sometimes all it takes is one person who believes in you to turn things around." It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Sarah's expression softened slightly. "That's admirable, Mr. Rose. But caring isn't enough. If you want to become Marcus's legal guardian, even temporarily, you'll need to demonstrate that you can provide a stable, safe environment. You'll need to show steady income, appropriate housing, and you'll need to pass our screening process. Asa? Pete felt his heart sink. Steady income was already a problem, and he could only imagine what the screening process would reveal about his recent troubles. What if, he said slowly, we started with something smaller? What if Marcus stayed with me, while we worked on getting him back into school and reconnected with his family? Would that be possible? Sarah considered this. It's possible, but it would still require some oversight from our department. And we'd need Marcus's aunt to agree to the arrangement. She picked up her phone and dialed a number from the file. Pete and Marcus waited in tense silence as the phone rang. Linda, this is Sarah Martinez from Children's Services. Yes, we found Marcus. He's safe. No, he's not hurt. Actually, he's been staying with a gentleman who found him on the street. Pete could hear the voice on the other end of the line, rapid and emotional, though he couldn't make out the words. I understand you're upset, Sarah continued, but right now I need to know if you'd be willing to meet with us to discuss Marcus's situation. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock would work. Yes, bring your husband if you'd like. She hung up and turned back to them. Your aunt wants to see you, Marcus. She's been very worried. Marcus didn't look convinced, but he nodded. In the meantime, Sarah said to Pete, I'll need you to fill out some preliminary paperwork. Nothing too invasive yet, but we need basic information about your living situation, employment status, that sort of thing. She handed Pete a thick packet of forms. He glanced through them, his heart sinking further as he saw questions about criminal history, employment verification, and references. Is there a problem, Mr. Rose? Sarah asked, noticing his expression. Pete took a deep breath. If he was going to do this, if he was really going to try to help Marcus, he had to be honest about who he was and what he'd done. There are some things you should probably know about me, he said. Things that might complicate this process. Sarah leaned back in her chair. I'm listening. I'm Pete Rose, he said, and waited for recognition to dawn in her eyes. It took a moment, but when it came, her eyebrows shot up. Pete Rose. As in the baseball player Pete Rose. Former baseball player, Pete corrected. I was banned from the sport 3 years ago for gambling. There was a big scandal, lots of media coverage. I'm not exactly what you'd call an upstanding citizen these days. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying him with new eyes. Are you currently involved in any illegal activities? No, Pete said firmly. The gambling was a problem, but it's behind me now. Dune, have you been convicted of any crimes? No convictions. The league handled it internally. Marcus was looking back and forth between them, clearly trying to process this new information about the man who'd been helping him. Mr. Pete, he said quietly, you're famous. Was famous, Pete corrected. Now I'm mostly just infamous. Sarah made some notes in the file. This does complicate things, she admitted, but it doesn't necessarily disqualify you. The important thing is whether you can provide a safe, stable environment for Marcus. She looked at the boy. Marcus, now that you know this about Mr. Rose, how do you feel about staying with him? Marcus considered the question seriously. He's been good to me, he said finally. I don't know much about baseball, but I know he gave me food when I was hungry and a place to sleep when I was cold. That's what matters, right? Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile Pete had seen from her. That's exactly what matters, Marcus. She turned back to Pete. Fill out the paperwork as completely as you can. Be honest about everything. We'll find out anyway, and lying will only hurt your case. Tomorrow, we'll meet with Marcus's aunt and see what she has to say. After that, we'll figure out next steps. As they left the building, Pete felt emotionally drained. The weight of what he was trying to do was beginning to sink in. It wasn't just about giving Marcus a place to stay or helping him get back into school. It was about taking responsibility for another human being, about being the kind of person who could be trusted with that responsibility. "Mr. Pete," Marcus said as they walked to Pete's car, "are you in trouble? Like real trouble?" Pete considered how to answer. "I made some mistakes," he said finally. "Big mistakes that hurt a lot of people and ruined things I cared about. I'm trying to make better choices now, but it's not always easy." "Is that why you're helping me, to make up for the bad stuff?" The question was so direct, so insightful, that Pete had to stop walking and really think about his answer. "Maybe partly," he said. "But mostly it's because when I met you, I saw something in you that reminded me of who I used to be before I lost my way. And I thought maybe if I could help you stay on the right path, it might help me find mine again." Marcus nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. "Like we're helping each other." "Yeah," Pete said, surprised by how right that sounded. "Like we're helping each other." That evening, as Pete struggled through the paperwork Sarah had given him, Marcus sat at the kitchen table doing homework in a workbook Pete had bought him. It was a peaceful scene, domestic in a way Pete had never experienced. For a moment, he could almost imagine what it might have been like to have a family, to have someone depending on him for more than just his ability to get base hits, but the forms in front of him were a stark reminder of reality. Question after question about his finances, his background, his fitness to care for a child. Each answer felt like an admission of how far he'd fallen, how little he had to offer. "You okay, Mr. Pete?" Marcus asked, looking up from his math problems. "Just tired," Pete said, though it was more than that. He was scared that he wasn't good enough, strong enough, stable enough to be what Marcus needed. "Tomorrow's going to be okay," Marcus said with surprising confidence. "Whatever happens with my aunt, it's going to be okay." Pete looked at the boy, this kid who'd been abandoned by his father, bounced between relatives and left to survive on the streets, yet somehow still had faith that things would work out. It was humbling and inspiring at the same time. "You know what, Marcus?" Pete said, putting down his pen. "You're probably right. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." And for the first time since he'd started filling out the forms, Pete actually believed it might be true. Linda Morrison was not what Pete had expected. He'd imagined someone harsh and uncaring, someone who would justify Marcus running away by being obviously unsuited to care for children. Instead, the woman who walked into Sarah Martinez's office was small and tired-looking, with worry lines etched deep around her eyes and flour still dusting her apron. She'd apparently come straight from her job at a bakery. Her husband Tom was with her, a big man with calloused hands and the kind of sun-baked complexion that came from years of construction work. He looked uncomfortable in the small office, too large for the plastic chair, his eyes darting between Marcus and Pete with obvious suspicion. "Marcus!" Linda rushed toward the boy, her arms outstretched, and Pete saw Marcus tense up before reluctantly accepting her embrace. "We've been so worried, honey, so scared something terrible had happened to you." "I'm okay, Aunt Linda," Marcus said quietly, extracting himself from her hug as quickly as politeness allowed. "Okay?" Tom Morrison's voice was rough, skeptical. "Boy, you've been living on the streets for 6 weeks. That ain't okay by any measure." Sarah motioned for everyone to sit down. "Let's talk about what happened and what we can do moving forward," she said. "Linda, can you tell me about Marcus's living situation at your house?" Linda glanced nervously at her husband before answering. "We tried to make it work," she said. "We really did. But with 4 kids already, money's tight and space is tighter. Marcus was sleeping on the couch in the living room, and the younger kids were complaining about not having anywhere to watch TV or play." "That's not why I left," Marcus said suddenly, his voice sharper than Pete had heard it before. "I left because I heard you and Uncle Tom fighting about me, about how I was eating your food and costing money you didn't have, about how I wasn't really your responsibility." Linda's face flushed red. Marcus, honey, that's not... We were just stressed. We didn't mean... You said my dad dumped me on you like a piece of garbage, Marcus continued, his voice getting louder. You said he was a drunk and a loser, and I'd probably end up just like him. Marcus, Tom said sharply, you don't talk to your aunt that way. Why not? Marcus shot back. She talked about me that way. She said it right in front of me, like I wasn't even there. Pete felt his protective instincts kick in. Easy, son, he said quietly, putting a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. The boy was trembling with anger and hurt. Tom Morrison turned his attention to Pete for the first time. And who exactly are you in all this? Some guy who picks up kids off the street? Tom, Linda said warningly, but her husband continued. I've been asking around about you, Rose. Yeah, I know who you are. Used to be famous. Now you're nothing but a washed-up gambler who got kicked out of baseball for cheating. What kind of man are you to be taking care of a child? Pete felt his own temper rising, but Sarah intervened before he could respond. Mr. Morrison, let's keep this productive, she said firmly. We're here to figure out what's best for Marcus, not to assign blame or make accusations. What's best for Marcus, Tom said, is to come home with his family where he belongs. Home. Marcus stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. It's not my home. You made that clear. I was just in the way, just another mouth to feed that you couldn't afford. That's not true, sweetheart, Linda said, tears starting to form in her eyes. We love you, your family. Then why didn't you come looking for me? Marcus demanded. Why didn't you come find me when I first ran away? Why did it take 6 weeks and a social worker for you to even know where I was? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Linda opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly struggling for an answer. We called the police, Tom said defensively, filed a missing person report. We did what we were supposed to do. But you didn't look, Marcus said quietly, his anger giving way to something that sounded like heartbreak. You didn't come to the places where kids like me go. You didn't ask the other street people if they'd seen me. You just filled out a form and waited for someone else to find me. Pete wanted to reach out to the boy, to offer comfort, but he could see that Marcus needed to get this out, needed to say the things that had been building up inside him. You know who did look for me, Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Nobody. Nobody looked for me until Mr. Pete found me by accident, and you know what? He didn't have to help me. He didn't have to give me food or a place to sleep or try to get me back in school. But he did, because that's what decent people do. Tom Morrison stood up abruptly, his face red with anger. Now you listen here, boy. Sit down, Pete said, his voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. Sit down and listen to what he's saying. Don't tell me what to do, Tom snapped. You don't have any right. I have the right of someone who's been taking care of Marcus for the past 2 weeks, Pete said, standing to face the larger man. I have the right of someone who's seen him do his homework every night and helped him practice reading and watched him try to figure out how to trust adults again after the ones who were supposed to love him let him down. That's enough, Sarah said firmly. Everyone sit down, now. The authority in her voice cut through the tension, and slowly, reluctantly, both men took their seats. Marcus remained standing for a moment longer, his small frame rigid with emotion, before sinking back into his chair. Sarah looked around the room, her expression serious. This is exactly why Marcus ran away in the first place, she said. He's sitting right here, listening to adults argue about him like he's a piece of property instead of a human being with feelings and opinions. She turned to Marcus. What do you want, Marcus? If you could choose what happens next, what would that look like? Marcus glanced at Pete, then at his aunt and uncle, then back at Sarah. I want to stay with Mr. Pete, he said quietly but firmly. He makes me feel like I matter, like I'm not just a problem that needs to be solved. Linda started crying in earnest now. Marcus, honey, You do matter. You matter so much to us." "Then why didn't it feel that way?" Marcus asked, and the simple question seemed to deflate all the fight out of the room. Tom Morrison looked down at his hands, his anger replaced by something that might have been shame. We tried, son, but we're barely keeping our heads above water as it is. When your daddy left you with us, we thought it would be temporary. We thought he'd get his act together and come back for you." "Has he?" Marcus asked. "Come back, I mean." Tom shook his head. "We haven't heard from him since April." The silence that followed was heavy, with the weight of abandonment and broken promises. Pete felt his heart break for Marcus all over again. This kid had been let down by every adult who was supposed to protect him. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah said gently, "I understand that your family is under financial stress, but Marcus has been living on the streets. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what could have happened to him?" Linda sobbed harder, covering her face with her hands. Tom's jaw worked silently, as if he were trying to find words that wouldn't come. "I've seen the other kids out there," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the emotion in the room. "I know what happens to some of them. Bad things, scary things. But I still felt safer on the streets than I did feeling like nobody wanted me." Pete found his voice. "This isn't about blame," he said, looking directly at Tom and Linda. "It's about what's best for Marcus going forward. And right now, what's best for him is feeling wanted and safe and valued." "And you think you can provide that?" Tom asked, though the hostility had gone out of his voice. "A man with your problems." "I think I can try," Pete said honestly. "I think Marcus and I understand each other in a way that maybe we both needed." Sarah made some notes in her file. "Here's what I'm proposing," she said. "Marcus, you'll continue staying with Mr. Rose for now, but we'll set up regular visits with your aunt and uncle. We'll also work on finding your father and getting him into a treatment program if he's willing." She looked at Pete. "Mr. Rose, you'll need to complete the full guardian application process. That includes background checks, home visits, and parenting classes. Are you willing to do that?" Pete felt a moment of panic. The background check would reveal everything: the gambling, the debts, the spectacular fall from grace. But looking at Marcus, seeing the hope in the boy's eyes, he knew he had to try. "Yes," he said, "I'll do whatever it takes. And you, Linda and Tom," Sarah continued, "you'll need to work with me to understand what went wrong and how we can make sure Marcus feels welcome in your family, whether he's living with you or not." Linda nodded through her tears. "We want to make this right," she said. "We love Marcus. We didn't know how to handle everything." "Can I ask you something, Aunt Linda?" Marcus said suddenly. "Of course, honey. If my dad comes back, if he gets better, would you want me to live with him again?" Linda and Tom exchanged a look. "If he could take proper care of you," Linda said carefully, "if he could be the father you deserve, then yes. That's where you belong." Marcus nodded slowly. "And if he doesn't get better?" This time the pause was longer. Finally, Tom spoke up. "Then we'll figure out how to make room," he said gruffly. "Family sticks together, even when it's hard." It wasn't the most enthusiastic endorsement, but Pete could see it meant something to Marcus. The boy needed to know he wasn't completely alone in the world, even if the situation wasn't perfect. As they prepared to leave the building, Linda pulled Pete aside. "Mr. Rose," she said quietly, "I want you to know I'm grateful for finding him, for taking care of him. I know we messed up, but we do love that boy." "I know you do," Pete said. "And he needs to know that too. Kids need to feel like they belong somewhere, like they're part of something bigger than themselves." Linda nodded. Can I call sometimes to check on him?" "Of course. He needs his family, Mrs. Morrison. All of his family." Walking to the car, Marcus was unusually quiet. Finally, as Pete started the engine, the boy spoke up. "Mr. Pete, what happens if you don't pass the background check? What happens if they say you can't take care of me?" Pete had been wondering the same thing. "I don't know, son. But whatever happens, we'll face it together. That's what families do." "Are we a family?" Marcus asked, his voice small. Pete felt his throat tighten. "Yeah, Marcus, I think we are." That evening, Pete sat at his kitchen table, filling out the Guardian application, while Marcus did homework nearby. The questions were invasive and detailed, asking about everything from his financial situation to his mental health history. Each answer felt like another nail in the coffin of his chances. "Having trouble?" Marcus asked, noticing Pete's frustrated expression. "Some of these questions are pretty personal," Pete admitted. Marcus put down his pencil and looked at Pete seriously. "Are you worried they won't let you keep taking care of me?" Pete sighed. "I'm worried that my past mistakes might hurt your future chances." "What kind of mistakes?" Pete had been dreading this conversation, but he knew Marcus deserved honesty. "I used to bet on baseball games," he said, "including games my own team played. It was wrong, and it got me banned from the sport for life." Marcus considered this. "Did you ever bet against your own team?" "No," Pete said quickly. "I always bet on us to win." "So you never tried to lose on purpose?" "Never. I played to win every single game." Marcus shrugged. "Then you made a mistake, but you weren't a cheater. There's a difference." The simple wisdom of the statement caught Pete off guard. This kid, who had every reason to be cynical about adults and their failures, was offering him understanding and forgiveness. "The people who make these decisions might not see it that way," Pete said. "Then they don't know you like I do," Marcus replied, returning to his homework as if the matter were settled. 3 days later, Pete's phone rang. It was Sarah Martinez. "Mr. Rose, I need you to come in. We've completed our preliminary review of your application, and we need to discuss some concerns that have been raised." Pete's heart sank. "What kind of concerns?" "It would be better if we discussed this in person. Can you come in tomorrow morning? And please bring Marcus." Pete hung up the phone with shaking hands. Marcus looked up from the book he was reading, Tom Sawyer, which Pete had picked up at a used bookstore. "Who was that?" "Sarah Martinez. We need to go see her tomorrow." "Is it bad news?" Pete didn't want to lie to the boy, but he also didn't want to frighten him unnecessarily. "I don't know yet. But whatever it is, we'll handle it." Marcus nodded and went back to his book. But Pete could see the worry in the set of his shoulders. That night, Pete lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if he'd made things worse for Marcus by trying to help. Maybe the boy would have been better off if Pete had just kept walking that night on Vine Street. But then he thought about Marcus's smile when he'd successfully solved a difficult math problem, about the way the boy had started sleeping through the night without nightmares, about the confidence that was slowly returning to his voice. Whatever happened tomorrow, these past few weeks had been good for both of them, and maybe that was enough to fight for. The morning sky was overcast, threatening rain, as Pete and Marcus walked up the steps to the Department of Children's Services building. Pete's stomach churned with anxiety, and he could feel Marcus's tension radiating beside him. They'd barely spoken during the drive downtown, both lost in their own worried thoughts. Sarah Martinez met them in the lobby this time, which Pete took as either a very good sign or a very bad one. Her expression was unreadable as she led them not to her office, but to a larger conference room. "I've asked some additional people to join us today," she explained as they walked down the hallway. "Given the complexity of Marcus's situation, we wanted to make sure we had all the perspectives we need." Pete's heart sank further. In his experience, meetings with lots of people were never good news. The conference room contained 4 adults Pete didn't recognize, along with Linda Morrison, who looked as nervous as Pete felt. She gave Marcus a tentative smile, which he returned with a small nod. "Let me introduce everyone," Sarah said, as they took their seats around the large table. "This is Dr. Patricia Henley, a child psychologist who specializes in trauma and family reunification. This is James Wright from our legal department. This is Michael Santos, who runs our kinship care program. And this is Detective Ray Coleman from the Cincinnati Police Department." Pete felt his blood turn to ice at the sight of the detective. This was it. They'd found something in his background check that disqualified him completely, maybe even something that would land him in legal trouble. "Before we begin," Sarah said, "I want everyone to understand that we're here because we all want what's best for Marcus. That's our only goal." She turned to Pete. "Mr. Rose, I'll be honest with you. Your background check raised some red flags. The gambling history, the debt issues, the fact that you're currently unemployed, these are concerns we have to take seriously when considering child placement." Pete nodded, his mouth too dry to speak. "However," Sarah continued, "we also conducted interviews with your neighbors, with the staff at the diner where you and Marcus eat regularly, and with several other people who have observed your interactions with Marcus over the past few weeks." She consulted her notes. "Mrs. Patterson from the diner said, and I quote, 'That man treats that boy like he's made of gold. I've never seen a father and son care more about each other, and I've been watching families eat in my restaurant for 30 years. Pete felt a flicker of hope. "Your neighbor, Mrs. Chen, reported that she's heard Marcus laughing and playing in your apartment, that she's seen you helping him with homework on your fire escape when the weather was nice. She said it's the most life she's seen in that building in years." Dr. Henley leaned forward. "I'd like to speak with Marcus privately, if that's all right." Marcus looked at Pete uncertainly. "It's okay," Pete assured him. "Dr. Henley just wants to make sure you're doing well." The psychologist was a kind-looking woman in her 50s, with gray hair and gentle eyes. She and Marcus moved to a corner of the conference room, while the adults talked quietly among themselves. Pete watched nervously as Dr. Henley asked Marcus questions he couldn't quite hear. The boy answered thoughtfully, occasionally glancing over at Pete with what looked like affection and trust. After about 15 minutes, they returned to the table. Dr. Henley made some notes before addressing the group. "In my professional opinion," she said, "Marcus is a resilient, intelligent child who has experienced significant trauma and abandonment. However, he shows clear signs of healing and increased emotional stability. He speaks about Mr. Rose with genuine affection and respect, and demonstrates age-appropriate attachment behaviors." She paused, looking directly at Pete. "Most importantly, Marcus feels safe and valued, which are the two most critical factors for a child's emotional development." Detective Coleman spoke up for the first time. "Mr. Rose, I'll cut to the chase. We looked into your gambling history pretty thoroughly. While it shows poor judgment, it doesn't suggest any danger to children. No history of violence, no substance abuse issues beyond the gambling addiction, no inappropriate behavior with minors." Pete felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "However," the detective continued, "there is one issue we need to address. Are you currently receiving any income, Mr. Rose?" This was the question Pete had been dreading. "My pension from Major League Baseball was suspended when I was banned," he said quietly. "I've been living off savings, but those are running low." "How low?" James Wright, the lawyer, asked. Pete swallowed hard. "Maybe 2 months' worth of expenses left." The room fell silent. Pete could feel Marcus looking at him with concern. "That's obviously a problem," Sarah said gently. "We can't place a child in a home where there's no reliable income." "But I'm looking for work," Pete said quickly. "I've got applications in at several places, and I could probably get something in construction or—" "Mr. Rose," Michael Santos interrupted, "what if I told you there might be another option?" Pete looked at him hopefully. "I run a program called Kinship Care, Santos explained. It's designed to help family members or family-like relationships provide care for children when the biological parents can't. It comes with a monthly stipend to help with expenses, and it provides support services like counseling and educational assistance. Are Mr. Rose and Marcus eligible for that? Linda Morrison spoke up for the first time. Normally, no, Santos admitted. The program is designed for actual family members, but given the unusual circumstances and given Marcus's clear preference to remain with Mr. Rose, we might be able to make an exception. Sarah looked at her notes. There would be conditions. Mr. Rose would need to complete parenting classes. Marcus would need to continue counseling with Dr. Henley. There would be regular home visits and check-ins. And Linda, you'd need to remain involved as Marcus's closest family member. Linda nodded eagerly. Whatever it takes. I want what's best for Marcus. What do you think, Marcus? Dr. Henley asked. How do you feel about this plan? Marcus looked around the table at all the adults who were trying to figure out his future. I think, he said slowly, that I want to stay with Mr. Pete. But I also want to see Aunt Linda sometimes, and maybe Uncle Tom too if he wants to see me. I do want to see you, Linda said, her voice thick with emotion. We all made mistakes, honey, but we love you. And what about your father? Dr. Henley asked gently. We've been trying to locate him. Marcus was quiet for a moment. If he gets better, if he stops drinking and wants to be a real dad, then maybe someday. But right now, Mr. Pete is the one who takes care of me. Pete felt his eyes burn with tears he didn't want to shed in front of all these people. This kid, who had every reason to give up on adults entirely, was still willing to hope that his father might change. Well then, Sarah said, gathering her papers, I think we have a plan. Mr. Rose, are you willing to participate in the kinship care program? Yes, Pete said without hesitation. Whatever it takes. Marcus, are you comfortable with this arrangement? Yes, ma'am. Then let's get started on the paperwork. 2 hours later, Pete and Marcus walked out of the building into the afternoon sunshine. The threatened rain had never materialized, and the sky was beginning to clear. So, Marcus said as they got into Pete's car, what happens now? Now we go home, Pete said, and realized for the first time that he meant it. His small apartment wasn't much, but it was home now for both of them. Mr. Pete? Yeah? Thank you for everything. Pete looked at this remarkable kid who had somehow wandered into his life and changed everything about it. Thank you too, son. 3 months later, Pete stood in the bleachers at Marcus's school, watching the boy play in his first Little League game since being back in school. Marcus had made the team despite joining late in the season, and while he wasn't the strongest player, his enthusiasm and work ethic had quickly made him a favorite among his teammates. Linda Morrison sat beside Pete, cheering loudly every time Marcus came to bat. Their relationship had improved significantly over the past months. She visited every Sunday, bringing homemade cookies and helping Marcus with his reading. Tom had even started coming sometimes, teaching Marcus how to throw a curveball in the small courtyard behind Pete's apartment building. Strike, the umpire called, as Marcus swung and missed. That's okay, baby, Linda shouted. You got this. Pete smiled, remembering his own Little League days, the nervous excitement of standing at the plate with your whole world watching. Marcus stepped back, took a practice swing, and set himself again. The next pitch was right down the middle, and Marcus connected solidly, sending the ball flying over the second baseman's head. He ran to first base with a huge grin on his face, and Pete found himself cheering louder than he had in years. After the game, a victory for Marcus's team, they went to celebrate at Mel's Diner. Mrs. Patterson made a big fuss over Marcus's game-winning hit, bringing him an extra large piece of apple pie without being asked. Mr. Pete, Marcus said as they walked home in the gathering dusk, do you think my dad will ever come back? They'd found Marcus's father 3 weeks earlier, living in a homeless shelter in Dayton. He was willing to enter a treatment program, but it would be a long process, and there were no guarantees. "I don't know," Pete said honestly, "but I know that whether he does or doesn't, you're going to be okay. You've got people who care about you now, like you and Aunt Linda. Like me and Aunt Linda and Mrs. Patterson and your teacher and your baseball coach and probably a dozen other people I haven't even thought of." Marcus considered this as they climbed the stairs to their apartment. "Mr. Pete, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Are you happy? I mean, with how things turned out?" Pete thought about the question as he unlocked their door. His life looked nothing like he'd imagined it would at this point. He was 54 years old, banned from the only profession he'd ever loved, living in a small apartment and raising a child who wasn't biologically his. By most measures, he'd fallen about as far as a person could fall. But as he watched Marcus carefully hang up his baseball uniform and start on his homework without being asked, as he thought about the routine they'd built together, the trust they'd developed, the way Marcus had started calling him Dad sometimes when he was tired or excited, Pete realized he'd never been happier. "Yeah, son," he said, ruffling Marcus's hair as the boy bent over his math problems. "I'm happy." And for the first time in years, Pete Rose meant it completely. Outside their window, Cincinnati settled into evening, the city lights beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness. Somewhere out there, other lost souls were wandering the streets, invisible to the world around them. But in apartment 2B on Race Street, two people who had found each other when they both needed finding most were building something that neither had expected to discover: a family. Pete settled into his recliner with the newspaper while Marcus worked on his homework at the kitchen table. It was a quiet, ordinary evening. The kind that might not seem remarkable to anyone looking in from the outside, but to Pete Rose, who had once lived his life in front of crowds of thousands, this quiet domesticity felt like the greatest victory of his career. He'd been wrong about a lot of things in his life, had made mistakes that cost him almost everything he'd thought mattered. But he'd been right about one thing: sometimes all it takes is one person who believes in you to turn everything around. The difference was, he'd thought he was going to be that person for Marcus. It had taken him months to realize that Marcus had been that person for him. As the boy worked carefully through his math problems, occasionally asking for help with particularly difficult ones, Pete found himself thinking about second chances, about redemption, about the unexpected ways grace can enter a life that seems beyond saving. He'd spent 3 years believing his story was over, that the best chapters of his life were behind him. But watching Marcus succeed in school, seeing the confidence return to the boy's eyes, feeling useful and needed and valued again, Pete realized his story was just beginning a new chapter. And maybe, just maybe, it was going to be the best chapter yet.